All right. So tonight we're going to be covering from Masada, basically the end of the Jewish war to the Bar Kochba Revolt. And then I'll take some questions, and if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that might apply, some of the stuff that we studied tonight might apply to things we see in Scripture. And that's if we have time, which I think we will. But we'll get started here. Where we left off last week, you had Jerusalem falling to the Romans. It was being burnt, and the temple was burned down, and the Romans just utterly destroyed all of the city, tearing down much of its walls, burning a lot of the buildings. And so Jerusalem is now under Roman control and gone.
Trying to grab the other one.
You're in the picture anyway. Just anyways. So and Rome has gained control of most of this area. The three places left are Herodium, Machaerus, and Masada. Now, Herodium and Machaerus fall relatively quickly. Herodium, if you'll remember, this was the palace that King Herod the Great built. It has a fortress on the top of the hill, which he elevated the hill to this height. He made it taller and built the fortress there. This is King Herod the Great's tomb, so it's where Herod was entombed. But they had inhabited this fortress, but the Romans were able to capture that. Machaerus is on the other side of the Dead Sea. So this is the Dead Sea in the distance. It's hard to see in that picture. This is where they took just a graphic and put it over the hill so you can see about what the fortress used to look like. Does anybody recognize the name Machaerus as a fortress mentioned somewhere in the New Testament? Do you remember what famous prisoner was held here?
Paul, maybe?
No? He lost his head. John the Baptist. This is where John the Baptist was held until the command came to have him beheaded. So those two fall to Rome, and all that is left then is Masada. So Masada is this palace complex on top of a mesa that in the top part of this mesa had a number of buildings and stuff, and it had a wall going all the way around the very top of it. And you can see just how great of a fortress that was. We talked about it back during the lesson about Herod the Great, how it's fed with water that comes down, and these actually were channels that channeled water into cisterns, which all these holes along the side were cisterns, and then you'd send somebody down the hill to go get the water and bring it back up. There were hot baths and everything that were in Masada. The capturing of Masada was a real challenge. You can see this area that is in red here. That area was built by the Romans just to capture it. And it's one of the greater feats of engineering that you'll see in ancient warfare. This area here, you can kind of see the bedrock right here that went out. And then they just had to build everything up on top of that to try to get so they could put their war machines up to where the wall was. This was the main camp of the Romans. It's still there. And in fact, most of the camps, if you go to Masada, you can actually see where all the Roman camps were. You're going to see that in the pictures that follow after this. And this camp, you can see actually another camp right here. There's actually a wall that passes through this and goes down and continues all the way around. And the wall that they built to keep them in, you can see the wall going up here, the wall coming along here, some of the wall there. So they built a wall all the way around to keep everybody in so nobody could escape. This is a picture from inside Masada. These are pictures I took when I went and visited. So that if you were in one of the buildings looking out on the Dead Sea side, the east side, you're able to look right down at the Roman camps. These are both Roman camps here. You can see the wall that they built right here still in there. Inside Masada, you had palatial type of accommodations because Herod had built it up. This is all that we have left, but you can see all the coloring on the walls, and we're going to see a little bit later, in a sense, how this is similar and different from some of the colors that we see in Pompeii when they uncovered Pompeii. Now, a lot of times when you see ancient times portrayed, the walls are all just the drab stone and stuff like that. It's very uncommon. Even in your normal house, that stone would have been covered with plaster, and often that plaster was mixed with pigments so that it created patterns and different colors and so on and so forth. So the homes were actually a lot nicer than we typically think. Just over the years with the weather, that stuff cracks off and falls off, and all you have is the stones underneath left behind. But especially in nicer accommodations like Herod's Palace, you had this kind of colors and color schemes. And as I said, they had hot tubs and baths. This is one of the baths that they had there. I could show you a bunch of different ones, but I kind of want you to see the tile work that they had on the floor. And then there was stone work with tile that would have covered it. So this would have looked really luxurious when you're in there. And this is on top of that mesa in the middle of the desert that they have a bunch of water being brought to. So you can see here, this is looking down at those same two camps, but you can see more clearly the wall that is still left. You can see two little hikers right there. Gives you a little bit of an idea of the scale. You're not allowed to take any rocks off of the wall because otherwise it's not going to be there for other generations. I just didn't even walk near it because I knew I'd be too tempted not to take one. I'm like, it's just one rock, and it's famous. Anyways, but so you can see the wall and the camps set up there. This is a closer up view that I took of the Roman camp, and you can see this is the kind of the headquarters area that's built up, and then this would be the broader area that had the surrounding camp. And in these, there were streets. You can see where the gates were. And these gates are made so that you have to enter and then go left so that you couldn't just go straight in. And in turning left, they would have been able to attack you while you were in. But it's just interesting to see they literally built cities when they went to conquer something, even out here in the middle of the desert. This next one gives you a sense. This is two of the friends that we had on the Israel trip. This gives you a sense of the distance. They're standing where the palace was in Masada, looking out at where that Roman camp is. So you could stand right there, be waving to them and so on and so forth. But they were able to watch the Romans. This is the ramp that they built, seen from the top of Masada. You see this portion here, this here. They had catapults mounted at some of these places that you see leveled off. And they would have their different war machines, and then they slowly built up this ramp all the way up. These are people standing on top of the ramp, so that gives you, again, the scale, the little teeny things. They took their giant siege tower and brought it up that ramp. So this is looking straight down the ramp towards it, and you can see it kind of comes up like this, and then they put things to hold that earthen wall together, and then they put their giant siege tower. This siege tower was basically about 8 to 9 stories tall. This is why I'm glad I wasn't a Roman soldier, because I'm scared of heights. And you put me out on the top of this thing without a railing to try to tell me to go attack a wall, I'd be like, oh, no. Now, this right here that you might be able to see, that is a battering ram. So how they got that battering ram 50 feet up in the air and stuff, but they would have that on these ropes, and they would swing it like a big pendulum into that wall to batter down that wall. When they finally did get this built and got up to the top of the wall, the people inside had built an inner wall, expecting them to break through. At that point, it was pretty obvious where they were going to be breaking through. But the inner wall was wood. And so once they broke through the first wall, then they just launched torches and everything over and burnt the second wall down. Now, when that wall was burning down, the Jews realized that they were going to, lose the battle. Then what happened was inside there was about 960 some people inside, and the person who was leading this group was named Eliezer. And he had been leading the Zealots in Masada ever since the war had started. And he convinces everybody, you can't surrender to the Romans, it's going to be slavery, it's going to be horrible, so on and so forth. we should all just kill ourselves. And there was a number of people that didn't want to do that. He could tell from the looks on their faces and stuff, and so he shames them until he gets them into this big tizzy, and they all decide we're gonna go ahead and commit suicide. And so they selected all the heads of the families killed their families. Then they selected 10 men by lot who killed all the other men, and then they had to select one man from those 10 to kill the other 9, and then he had to fall on his sword. So that was not a pleasant thing. And so when the Romans broke in, they found no one but one. There was a mother and a grandmother and 5 kids that had hid in some of the caverns below. Now, this is contested. This is Josephus's recording. It's contested by some Jews, but the contesting that I've heard, they're like, well, some people got out of Masada. Well, yeah, they got out of Masada before they actually broke through all the walls. But then on top of that, they were like, tried to say, this doesn't seem very Jewish, but it's like, okay, these zealots weren't normal Jewish folk, and on top of that, there's a lot of other stories from different historians of how the Jews reacted and such. Now, they do get carried away. Some of the Roman historians accuse the Jews of cannibalism and stuff at a level that probably didn't happen. Like in Jerusalem, we know that did happen. But I'm talking about cannibalism, like that's what they did once a year in their temple kind of thing. And so some Roman historians and such did get carried away, but Josephus would not have had a reason necessarily to do that. And so it is, I believe it is pretty accurate. Also, as a backup for that, they found some stones that had been marked in one particular area as choosing for lots, and so they actually found some of the stones that they had used for that, and it actually fits the story, the number of stones that they found and such.
I mean, what value did Masada have for the Romans? Why were they wanting to take it? What was there that was so valuable in that desert?
It was at this point it was they knew that if they let them go, it was like a yeast that was going to probably spread through everything again. But the Romans were ticked at this point. In other words, they were ready to just erase all of this zealot movement and punish the ones that had done it. Because at that point, if you do that and some people live and get away, then that emboldens other people in other areas to do the same thing. But usually this is we're making an example out of you type of move. But it is a question. It's a good question because that was raised by others. Like, why do that? Why go to all the trouble when that's just the last little enclave that's there? And it was to make an example out of them. So
that wasn't uncommon for Rome. There was, I don't remember the name of the tribe, but there was a tribe in Gaul.
Yep.
That was persistently troublesome.
Yes. And
the Romans went in and they just wiped them all out.
Right. Yeah. It was common for Rome. It's actually common for just about every nation. Mm-hmm. Because that fear of, you remember what they did over there, kept people from certain behaviors, and so they would do that. So once Masada is captured, the war with the Jews is over. The war as a whole took 7 years. That place where the fighting within Jerusalem and the temple got so bad that you couldn't do the daily sacrifices anymore was at 3.5 years into that war. The reason why that is significant is you get to Daniel 9, and it talks about the person coming who's going to, there's an anointed one, and the anointed one will be cut off, and then there's going to be, the people of the anointed one come, and then there's the abomination of desolation, and then destruction, overflows, and it's like, but that whole thing of the prediction of the daily sacrifices being cut off at 3.5 days into that week. This is 70 weeks of Daniel. That is a big reason why many people feel that was fulfilled in 70 AD, because the daily sacrifices were cut off at 3.5 years in the middle of a 7-year war, which would be the 70th week, and it fits quite well with what Daniel says. And it also makes you realize why Daniel, after having that vision and understanding what he could of it, has dread and he is depressed for weeks because he's basically been told this many weeks until your people are cut off and done. And so not as a nation, they continue as a nation in the sense of a people group and an ethnicity, but they no longer have a country or a political entity for 2,000 years. And there's going to be an exception to that, but we'll hit it in this lesson. So Emperor Titus, Vespasian was the one who was emperor during that war in 70 AD. And Vespasian survives until 79 AD. While Vespasian is reigning as emperor, Titus, his son, is kind of co-ruling. They're both called Caesars. They both have the same title. And he was given various positions of authority. He was given the council position, which was like being made president. And so Titus was ruling right next to his father the entire time. It was almost always a dual rule. Titus himself ruled by himself for only 2 years. But something about Titus, with all the time that he spent there in Israel, he ended up falling in love with Bernice, the sister of Herod Agrippa II. Now, Herod Agrippa II, I don't remember if I remembered to put it within the lesson, but in Jerusalem when things were getting bad, he was one of the first people put to death by the zealots that were there. So Herod Agrippa II dies in Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa II and Bernice may have been a couple. And that's when you look at the history and different things, neither one, Herod Agrippa didn't marry. He went everywhere with Bernice. You see that everywhere. Bernice doesn't marry, and so on and so forth. But then Agrippa, he dies, and Titus is there, and Titus falls in love with Bernice. And so when he returns to Rome, victorious and such, he brings Bernice with him, and he wants to marry her. However, the Roman people have an issue with a foreign bride. You remember Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So this bride from the east has them concerned, and there's pushback, and they don't want him to marry her, and he really pushes to marry her, and eventually he's convinced otherwise, and so he has to send Bernice away. So Bernice does not end up marrying Titus. We don't know a lot of what happens to Bernice, but we are going to find out what happens to Drusilla, which was Agrippa and Bernice's other sister. So the hero of the war with the Jews is what Titus was known as. He's the one who conquered them. He comes back. Vespasian and Titus share the triumph coming into the parade that they have coming into Rome. It's in both of their honors, and it shows you how much the dad and the son were kind of equal. He is in the triumph. He leads through, as we talked about last week, at the end of that parade was Simon, and he is led into the forum, and he is killed as a celebration of that final victory. And then there's an arch that we're going to see that is created to remember this by his brother. He basically had, before he left the east, there were some kings in the area that were meeting with him, and they got together and they offered him this victory wreath. And according to Philostratus, one of the historians, he says that Titus refused the victory wreath because it was simply the wrath of God against them. He was simply the arms of God in doing that, and so he did not want to accept that. And so that's an interesting thing, and realize too, Titus and Josephus had become good friends all throughout the war with Rome. And so Josephus' perspective probably had an influence on Titus at that point. And you can see here, interestingly, he becomes very good friends with Josephus. He wants to marry Bernice, so he actually, in being there, does not seem to be too severely anti-Jewish in the friends that he seems to choose. But then with his not being anti-Jewish, the war with the Jews and other things that come out are going to turn now so that the Jews begin to experience much more severe persecution within the Roman territories, and that's going to bring Christians into it as well, because Christians at this point are still seen entirely as Jews, just a branch of Judaism. This is the Arch of Titus. This section that you see right here is on the inside, on this side of the Arch of Titus. This has been somewhat repaired on the outside. There were times that it was in worse condition and they've repaired that, but on the inside it's still quite the original engraving. The thing that's important about it is what you see them carrying, because these are the articles of the temple from Jerusalem that they're coming in. So this is a little bit closer, and what do you see in the middle? You see the lampstand, the golden lampstand that they had. And this is one of the only places where we have a picture of it made by somebody who probably saw it. So this is probably our most accurate portrayal of what it was. These that they're carrying, I would imagine, are the signs that used to be posted to the Gentiles saying you can't go past here or you're worthy of death. I would think they would be carrying those like a ha 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 ha, we wiped this out. I don't know what else that would be, because it does not fit the description of any other temple articles that I'm aware of. So the arch was built by Domitian after Titus dies, commemorating that. We'll talk about that in just a second. But one of the biggest building projects that Emperor Titus accomplishes is the Flavian Amphitheater, which we know as the Colosseum. It's called a Colosseum today, not because of the type of building it was. In fact, the whole type of building comes from this. It was called the Colosseum because just outside of it was this statue of Jupiter, supposedly, that Nero had made in his own image as Jupiter. That statue was big enough that if you and I were standing on, like, the big toe would be like this big. And so it was a big statue, and they called it a colossus because of the big statue. And this was built right next to that, so it's the Colosseum. So that's how you get the name Colosseum from that. Otherwise, it was an amphitheater, which basically means a double theater. A single theater is you'll see in the Roman theaters, the Greek theaters we'll see, especially in the next section of this class, they would be a half circle with stands and stuff. So amphitheaters means double, so it's the full oval. So anything that's a full oval is an amphitheater. And then if it's just the actual half, then it's the theater. So Vespasian began it. It was completed in Titus's reign, and there were huge games that were celebrated and done within the amphitheater at first, and then it became a place of games for games and gladiator things in the years to come. The Colosseum is a place where Christians do end up dying, and in the reign of Domitian is one of the first times that Domitian is going to be Titus's brother. But it is a place over the years that Christians end up being thrown to the lions and such, as we've heard in history. This is just to show you the complexity of it. It actually had the ability to draw shades out over the crowd, and it held a good number of people. I want to say 50,000, but I might be wrong. Maybe less than that. You were able to flood the bottom of it and have naval battles. So they actually would fill it with water at times and have ships go out and do naval battles. But then you still had the ability to open doors from below and have animals come out. I mean, so the technology, they're able to do some pretty amazing things that we just wouldn't even think they were capable of that time. And so this is an amazing construction. Today, it looks, like this, and is not at its former glory. Inside, you can see they redid the surface a little bit to show you what it was like. But underneath, all of these rooms would have held the animals, the gladiators, and everything else like that. And then there were elevators that could actually bring you up to the surface and drop you down again. and then the people, these are all people standing on the sides. That gives you a little bit of a scale when you're looking at it. So it's at this time, when Titus comes to full power, that Mount Vesuvius erupts. This is the one that takes out Pompeii and Herculaneum. And one of the things about this is that some people felt, the Jews definitely felt, that this was God punishing Titus for having destroyed the temple and having destroyed Jerusalem. It's really kind of an interesting thing, because he sees himself as the arm of God, doing these things and so on and so forth. Yet at the same time, did he go about it in a way that was displeasing to God? Like, where was God, good with him destroying it? And there's ways. When Nebuchadnezzar was brought in to destroy Babylon, God makes very plain, you are my agent to destroy Jerusalem. Yet the way in which the Babylonians went about it was still displeasing to God and unjust, because they almost did it with too much zeal. So there still was a discipline of them. And whether that was true with Titus, we won't know until we get to heaven. When Mount Vesuvius erupts, the type of eruption it was, for thousands of years, people thought it was almost mythological. Because we have one account that comes from Pliny the Younger, in his letters to Tacitus, telling him what happened. And they're like, no, that couldn't have happened until we have Mount St. Helens go off. Because Mount St. Helens erupted much the same way that Mount Vesuvius did, and had much the same effect. And it was the first time that we had seen an eruption where basically a large amount of the side of the mountain just collapses and falls down, and you have what are called pyroclastic flows. Once we saw that with Mount St. Helens, then we believed more thoroughly the testimony that was given to Tacitus by Pliny the Younger. In this eruption, you have Herculaneum and Pompeii. In Pompeii, one of the people that was there, as you see in your notes, was Herod Agrippa II's sister, Drusilla. So you have Herod Agrippa II, who was king, which we learned about. Bernice, who may have been with him, but then ended up being with Titus, and then she was sent away. Now Drusilla, the third sibling there, all children of Herod Agrippa I, or Agrippa the Great, she was in Pompeii when it erupted, and she is one of those killed in that eruption, as well as Antonius, the son of Antonius Felix, so the man that Paul sat before for his court in Caesarea. The son of that man dies in the eruption. So there are kind of some direct connections to Scripture. The eruption, when you see here this line, the green line is where the coast used to be until the eruption happened. And so you can see how much earth flowed down the mountain. And when it did, one of the reasons why they didn't believe it is the story has the entire Bay of Naples almost emptying and then rushing back in, which now, we've seen tsunamis now, we've seen those things, we realize, yes, that actually can happen. And so the Russian Navy, the Roman Navy was here at Mycenaeum, and Pliny the Elder, who's the father of Pliny the Younger, surprise, but Pliny the Elder is commanding the Navy at that time, and they saw this column go up as it erupts, and they saw the water go out and then rushing back in, and so he grabs a bunch of boats and attempts to go and to rescue them. And as he starts to get close to the coast, there's too much stuff raining down and falling and sulfur and rocks and everything else like that, and they start to where they can't breathe. And but they actually were taking pillows and tying it over their heads as like helmets to try to keep from being injured that way. And they end up instead diverting and going over to Stevii. And at Stevii, they continue to watch the eruption, and they're away from the fumes and such. But still, Pliny the Elder dies there from the exposure to the fumes that they had. Now, when these pyroclastic flows flowed down to Herculaneum and Pompeii, as we saw on the last slide, they ended up preserving them amazingly for us. Have you guys ever seen the Pompeii exhibit when it's at a museum? Okay.
It was on film.
I've seen
Okay.
a documentary, yeah.
Yeah, the documentary, they do have like traveling exhibits. There is one part of the exhibit you don't want to go into though, because it definitely shows how perverse the culture was. Pompeii was a lavish resort town, but it was like, we're talking, puts Vegas to shame for the immorality that was there. And so, as it erupted, this is a picture showing it. This is the actual layout of the town that we have uncovered. And so you can see this broad area here with the temple to Jupiter. And you can see the different temples there. I think this one was, I can't remember if this one was to Diana or to one of the other gods, and this is the temple to Jupiter. But because it preserves this, and when we talk about culture and stuff in the next section, we actually were able to find out a lot from Pompeii. And this, for instance, is basically a Roman fast food restaurant. You can see the different bowls for the different food. I mean, so you might as well be going to Panda Express at this point. And so you have the restaurants. You can see the colorful nature of the paint. You can see it's not just the plain brown and such like that. But as it covered everything, you guys are probably familiar with the fact that it created these places where what happened was it immediately buried everybody, and then when the bodies deteriorated, they left cavities of air. And so when they were undigging, when they got to a cavity like that, they had just a little hole, and they would pour plaster into it, and then wait for it to dry, and then they would take off everything around, and then the plaster would be in the shapes that they were finding here. And at first they didn't know what they were. They were just they just thought they were just these pockets of air for some reason. They didn't realize what the shape was as they took them apart, and then they started to do that in practice. It was Pompeii actually was a rediscovery in recent centuries, because I think it was in the 1700s that they rediscovered it. It had been discovered before, but because the artwork was so base and perverted, the church made them cover it up, and they couldn't get to it. But we see things like this. We'll talk a little bit about this in next section. We talk about the Roman roads, but it's a great picture of it. You can see they have the actual channels, and so only people, the Romans would sometimes create roads where you could only people with that wheelbase or that width would be able to go through it, and only certain people were able and allowed to make something with that wheelbase. So it let, for instance, soldiers and such to go down the roads much quicker and so on and so forth, but no one else was allowed to make it and be able to travel, like that, because that way they couldn't just take other carts and have the enemy use it and such. These stones are there because a lot of times these streets would flood and they would just have the water going down, and then it's like your way to walk across with that water being there. And sometimes that was their sewer. But this also shows you the elaborate colorfulness that was inside the rooms. So when we're talking about all these people and their palaces and stuff like that, this is what we're talking about. This is how Herod would have decorated. Now, you look at what we looked at earlier with Herod, and you see some of the almost the same colors, and like you look at the lower patterns, see how that's a very similar style because these are being made at about the same time. What you don't see is you're not going to see in different frescoes of Judea the people. Anyone want to guess why? Too close to a graven image. And so they didn't want to do images of people and so on and so forth. And so they often in Judea would not have had the pictures of people and then even maybe even animals because of their fear of breaking the law about graven images. So that was Mount Vesuvius. That occurs at the right in the middle of his 2-year reign. Titus goes and he gives a lot of his own money to help the area recover. But the amount of destruction that was done there was just, utterly devastating. There was really no Pompeii left after it was covered. Herculaneum, we actually found a lot of evidence that Herculaneum people trying to get away on the boats, but didn't succeed when the pyroclastic flows reached the shore there. While Titus is down at Mount Vesuvius investigating it, like when we have the president that goes and looks at a place with a natural disaster, so he's going and doing that, a fire breaks out in Rome, so this fire burns for 3 days. It's not as bad as the one that Nero started, but it still was really bad. And again, Titus uses his own money from his own coffers to pay for repairing this. And because of this, of course, he only reigned 2 years. He was one of the most popular and one of the most well-liked emperors in all the history of Rome. There were people that were worried he was going to turn into a Nero because he was that son of an important person who'd been putting things. But he actually, for the 2 years he was in, was a very good ruler. Also, when that fire broke out, there was also plague. Now, this combination of fire, plague, Vesuvius is why people feel, God was judging him for what had happened in Jerusalem, and that was a very strong sentiment by some. He ends up dying tragically after he gets back to Rome and helps rebuild it. He goes out on business and falls sick and then ends up dying. Now, he had always been somewhat ill during some of his time as co-reigning with his father. There is one story, if you guys remember how prior to Claudius, what was the gentleman's name that appointed Pilate? Starts with an S, and it's totally missing. Anyways, there was a time when the man who was trying to take control of the empire from Tiberius, that he had poisoned Tiberius's son. And Titus is said to have been a friend of that young man. And when that young man was poisoned, he felt so bad about it, he took some from the same cup to empathize with him, which made him direly sick back at that time. And then he recovers, but that may have been some of the source of his unhealth. But there's still also others that said that when he dies eventually, they feel that it was actually Domitian, his brother, that was slowly poisoning him to take over and to reign. And there's a lot of good reason to believe that, but there's no solid evidence or proof for that. But he ends up dying at the young age of 41, and his brother Domitian begins to reign. Now, Domitian is significant because he is the first one to really bring severe persecution of the Jews and of the Christians. And he also is, there's two very hotly debated dates as to when was the book of Revelation written. So there's those that are on the side of the book of Revelation was written during the reign of Domitian, because we have a church father from about the 200 to 300s AD that mentions that John was sent to the island of Patmos during the reign of Domitian. We have another church father that says the same thing, but the very same church father also says he was sent to the island of Patmos under Nero. And so there's this debate. Is Revelation written at the time of Nero, or is Revelation written at the time of Domitian? Now, until about the 1800s, Nero was actually the favored interpretation. But dispensationalism and other things came along that caused the Domitian timeline to become more favored, because if it's written during the time of Emperor Domitian, then the 7-year war with Rome is done. And how could it be predicting something that already happened? And therefore, it must be talking about something future, which is the favored position of almost all dispensationalists and such. And so there was a desire to take that view and see everything in the book of Revelation as future. But there was also those prior to that time who saw it as being fulfilled in 70 AD, a good amount of the book of Revelation being fulfilled in 70 AD. Now, most of us sitting in this room probably grew up in a tradition where the book of Revelation, once you get to chapter 4, it's all future. And that's something that developed later in church history. And there's some really strong evidences, as we're going to see a little bit of, as to why Revelation may have actually been talking about 70 AD. That's something we'll discuss at the end. But Domitian is, when you look at the reign of Domitian, he did persecute the Christians. John would have been almost, mid to late 80s at the time that this would have been happening, and so some question as to whether, would he still be going after somebody who is mid to late 80s? But anyways, this persecution under Domitian is because Domitian now comes in, and for the first time as a Roman emperor, he enforces that you have to worship the Roman gods. You have to sacrifice to them. He then goes to the Jews after the Jewish war, being able to be more anti-Jewish, because now the Jews, with the war with the Romans don't have the same favorable view of them as they used to. And so he begins to create a good amount of persecution. A lot of it is financial. You have to pay the Jewish tax. It's increased, but instead of the Jewish tax going to the temple, it had to go to the temple of Jupiter in Rome, which was a huge, huge violation. It'd be like taxing all of the Christians and taking all of our taxes and using it to pay for abortion. That's how offensive this was, if not more. And so he's when Christians and Jews uprise against this, he crushes them mercilessly, and he is a very violent emperor. He also, amongst Romans, was disliked. He openly sidelined the Senate. Between Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus and Titus, the Caesar had still kind of said, well, the Senate's the Senate. And there was still at least a nod to them. There was ways that they still followed certain policies and still placated the Senate. Domitian didn't care at all. He came in and he's like, Senate, I don't need a Senate. And he completely left them out of all of the ruling. He declared himself censor for life. Censor meaning like morality police. Now, don't think morality like we do as much as, he becomes the enforcer of religious ideas within Rome, that you have to do all of the things that he says. And then there are claims that he wanted to be addressed as Dominus. Sorry, I'm boring myself. He wanted to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, which would be Lord and God in Latin. And so now here's the thing: when we get to something like this, you say, well, what do you mean that some claim? Well, there are historians that say that he wanted to do this, but this is a man whose memory was completely wiped out by the people that came after him. And there is a tendency within the ancient world to paint people in the worst possible light, which means gossip and other things that you could pull out. So it might be true, it might not be true, different things like that. But from what we see, everything within history, he definitely was an evil man, and it's quite likely that he did require people to refer to him as Lord and God, which would have obviously caused a problem for any Christian and Jew encountering him. Now, as what happens when men get to that point, he was assassinated, and his death marks the end of the Flavian dynasty. Flavian dynasty is just Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, those three. So prior to that, you had the Caesarean dynasty, and it's usually called the Julio-Claudian line. So Julio for Julius Caesar, and then Claudius, because if you look at their names, it's always Julius Claudius something, Caesar, Julius Claudius something, and so that's the Julio-Claudio line, whereas this was the Flavian family. And this then brings us to the place of the 5 good emperors. These emperors, they're called the 5 good emperors because they managed things well. If you were Jewish and you would not have considered these 5 good emperors because these, especially Trajan and Hadrian, went after the Jews big time. Christians at this time are starting to become more distinct, and sometimes they get caught up in that, sometimes they don't. Now, after 70 AD, there were still Jews that lived in Judea. There were still Jews that would live in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem at this point is completely depopulated. Most of it's still in ruins. It does not get rebuilt, and so the people that are living there are doing so more out of religious faithfulness, and they fix up some things. Already at this point, what it seems is Christians have already marked the place of where Golgotha is and made it a place of worship and veneration toward remembering Christ. And so there are Christians that are back in Jerusalem that are living there and together with those Jews. What ends up happening is they live in that state for about 50 years, 45 years actually. And then you have what is referred to as Keto's War, or just a rebellion of the Jews. This rebellion was different than what you had in 70 AD because it was not fought mainly in the Promised Land. It was fought, as it says here, in Cyprus, Cyrene, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. What's significant, though, is especially in the area of Cyrene, this was messianic. It was, in other words, we're now starting to see people come up and claiming to be a Messiah for the Jews, and the Messiah is going to be the one who brings them back into the land and rebuilds, and they're taking prophecies as referring to that. So there's a growing false Messiah situation that's happening here. What ends up happening, I realized that the first 2 lines were from a previous version that should have been deleted, so that's why it looks different than your notes. So what happens is after Domitian dies, you have, who is the one in between Trajan and Nerva? So you have Emperor Nerva, very an older gentleman who comes in, who is actually a very balanced emperor, who was actually wise and one of their best emperors. Organizes the government very well, puts things back into the hands of the Senate, and so on and so forth. And then he passes power on to Trajan after he dies. And he's not assassinated, he actually just dies naturally. And so Trajan then comes to power. And when Trajan comes to power, there is an increased persecution on the Jews. Their tax that we talked about, where it has to be applied to the temple of Jupiter, that becomes increased. And the Romans start to turn more and more against the Jews. Well, why is this? Well, during this time, with Trajan, they are having a campaign into Parthia, which is Mesopotamia, old Babylon and Assyria. There's huge Jewish populations in those areas. And when Rome goes in to fight against the Parthians, the Jews in those areas fight with the Parthians against the Romans. And this makes the Romans mad. Like, why are you've been, with us, so on and so forth, and now are you trying to rebel against us? And so they side with the Parthians. So the Jews are increasingly looked down upon and increasingly persecuted. And so this fiscus Judaicus, which is that half shekel tax we talked about, starts going to the temple of Jupiter, and they increase it all the more on them so that it's a huge financial burden. So then in Cyprus and Cyrene and Egypt, you see these rising up. In Egypt, it's a rising up in Alexandria. of the Jews that are there. Cyrene is west of Egypt. It's right on the edge of Egypt and Libya, and so Cyrene, you have this guy that rises up and he's claiming to be a Messiah, and everybody rises up with him and they start fighting back. Now this is a combination of Gentiles fighting against the Jews and the Jews fighting back, or the Jews starting to attack the government buildings and the temples and stuff like that that are there in those other cities out of retribution for their persecution financially and so on and so forth. And so on Cyprus, when these uprisings start, they're put down, and Jews are not allowed on the island again, and they're not recorded. We have no recorded Jewish presence on Cyprus for 400 years. And there used to be a huge Jewish presence on Cyprus, because that's who Paul and Barnabas went to. They went to all those Jewish synagogues as they went through Cyprus on that first missionary journey. In Judea, Lucius Quietus is the one who ends up putting down, he was a governor in Syria, and he went and put down the Jews in Mesopotamia, and he does so quite harshly. And by the way, this is where you get Quito's War. How? Well, Quietus, Quito, you guys see it at least has the same consonants, but it's a corruption of his name, Quietus, like Quietus's War or Quito's War. And then he puts it down to Mesopotamia, and then they make him governor of Judea, and it's kind of like we're making an anti-Jewish person governor of Judea again, and so that causes some angst with the Jews that are in Judea, and there's an angst amongst the Jews all around the Roman Empire now, and they're kind of ripe to be stirred up again. So about 20 years after this Quito's War and the rebellion there, we now have the last Jewish revolt, which is the Bar Kochba revolt that happened under Emperor Hadrian. So under Trajan, there's this persecution that is there, and when Trajan dies, Hadrian becomes emperor, and he actually travels to Jerusalem. And while he's at Jerusalem, we'll go a slide ahead here a second, he visits the Temple Mount, and he sees it in utter shambles. This is a model of how it probably looked after the destruction. And so seeing that, he has kind of a compassion on them, and he starts talking to them, I'm going to come and I'm going to rebuild Jerusalem, and we'll rebuild the temple. And the Jews become excited about this. There's not a lot of clear stuff that comes out, and as I look into it, there's some that would disagree with this, but they have poor reasons for disagreeing with it. What seems to be the case is, one, this governor that was put there named Rufus, who was anti-Jewish. This is now like 20 years after the last thing. He is not in favor of rebuilding the temple because he feels that it's going to embolden the Jews. He may have gotten that idea from the Samaritans, who may have gone to him, and then they plead to Caesar. And the Samaritans are pleading to not build a temple. Now, one of the guys, as I was studying this, who came back and was like, well, why would the Samaritans do that? They were kind of like Jews and so forth. But if you remember through history, when the Jews came back from Babylon and they went to rebuild the temple, who opposed them? Sanballat, the Samaritan. And the Samaritan, why? Because their temple had become the prime place of worship. And so to build a competing temple wasn't good for them. So I believe the Samaritans did have a huge part in getting the Roman governor Rufus to turn on this, and then them combined talking to Hadrian and bringing to light. And we know that the letter from the Samaritans to the king of Persia was this list of, look at how many times these people have rebelled and what they've done. You don't want them being able to gather around the temple. Well, now you've got all these other rebellions. You've got the Quito's War, you've got the 70 AD, and so you can see the Samaritans doing much the same thing. So Hadrian seems to have changed his mind. So in saying, I'm going to rebuild Jerusalem, I'm going to rebuild the temple, he instead rebuilds it as his own city, renames it Aelius Capitolina, and he puts a temple of Jupiter on the Temple Mount with the statue of himself standing in front of it, and then he also builds a temple to Venus over Golgotha to be against the Christians. Now, for us as Christians, the good part about this is he preserved the site of Golgotha. Instead of letting it fade into where no one remembers it, this temple ended up being a locator so we would know where it was. So this is how Jerusalem had looked before the war with Rome. The next picture is going to really be less, it'd be kind of cut off right here. This whole northern wall had been utterly torn down. This one had been torn down as well. These had been left standing for the most part, but the temple was torn down. And so the new Jerusalem that they built, it had these two main avenues that went down that were marketplaces. This is, you can't tell from the model, but this is actually higher than this one. This one is following the Tyropean Valley that goes between the temple and the upper, this was Upper Jerusalem, Lower Jerusalem. This was like the newer area of the city. This was outside of the city, and this is where the Temple of Venus was built, which is today the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and where Golgotha is. And so that location was preserved by that. And this is why I stand pretty strongly that when you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that is the actual site, because it was preserved fairly soon afterwards, intentionally to be defiled. For us as Christians, you can't defile it, in the same way. And so that didn't really work for Christians in that sense. So when Hadrian does this and switches, instead of the excitement of you're going to rebuild and there's going to be a temple, now it's a temple of Jupiter, which is a huge offense to them. Then they are ripe for revolt, and somebody rises up to lead them. So this is different from the Kitos rebellion, because the Kitos war was scattered and there wasn't an effort to recreate a state in Judea. The Bar Kokhba revolt starts in Judea, and its goal is to create a separate state. And the Bar Kokhba revolt starts in Modin, which is the same city that the Maccabean revolt started in. The other thing is that the leaders of the Bar Kokhba revolt realized they went about the war with Rome in the 60s in the wrong way, because they tried to face them on the open field or just in the cities, same way that Rome would typically fight. Whereas the Maccabeans, when they won against the Greeks, and those that were very successful against, the Roman general that came down to Jerusalem at first, that we talked about last week, Cestius. When he came back, he surrounded Jerusalem. When he left, they attacked him with guerrilla warfare, and they were pretty successful. And so this time, they intentionally go about a strategy of guerrilla warfare. They actually have a whole system of caves and paths that they take, and a system of communication. This was basically very much like the Ho Chi Minh Trail of Vietnam, where we go in with a superior weaponry, but they're beating us because they can just fade out of nowhere and then come out and attack you. And so they do a war like that with Rome, and they're actually very successful. They actually wipe out an entire Roman legion. So in the history, the Roman legion shows up in Judea, they're there, they talk about a battle, and then they just disappear from the record. Which means they got them. They took out the whole thing. They would never admit to that kind of a loss. And so they took out one whole legion, they took out another. So they end up, Hadrian ends up sending 1/3 of the entire Roman forces available in the whole Roman Empire to go tackle this, because he's done with it, because they were so successful at the beginning. Now this revolt was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, which is why it's called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, and he was claiming to be and professed to be a Messiah. Now, he claimed to be a Messiah, and he had a rabbi who was like this false prophet next to him, who was saying he's the Messiah, he's the Messiah, he's the Messiah. And people really respected the rabbi. Bar Kokhba himself, the name Bar Kokhba means son of the star. So it'd be Simon, son of the star. And this is seen as coming from Numbers 24:17. Do any of you have your Bible with you to be able to look that up? If you can, go ahead and do that. Now, he's also known in some writings as Bar Kochba, which means son of deception. And it's felt that the Jews, immediately after this revolt, realizing that he was a deceiver, gave him this name as a play on Bar Kochba. Now, some would say that the one is his actual real name and the other, but I think both of these are names given to him by others and weren't his original name to begin with. What ends up happening is, he leads this revolt, is quite successful in the first few years. They actually do succeed technically in having declared a separate Jewish state. Jerusalem's not rebuilt, it's not re-inhabited. They instead are staying in this small town fortress that's just southwest of Jerusalem. And when the Romans come in with their full force, it's like they're not just fighting a battle here, fighting a battle here. It's a systematic kill every Jew. Like they just start wiping out. There's probably at least as many or more killed in the Bar Kochba revolt than the Jewish war in 70 AD. There's over 1 million that are killed at this time as well. And they just pretty much march through and kill all of the Jews. And they get to this one last fortress where Simon is, and this false prophet guy, the rabbi that's been declaring him the Messiah, the story goes that there was a Samaritan that said, went to the Romans and said, I can cause a division with them. And the problem is as long as Eleazar, this rabbi, is still there and still pious, they'll never surrender the city. But if you can divide them, then you'll be able to conquer it. And so he sneaks into the city through underground passages and then gets into the city, and he walks up to the rabbi while he's meditating and just whispers something in his ear and then walks away. And what ends up happening is that gets reported to Simon Bar Kochba, and Simon Bar Kochba actually is in many ways lacking what you would want in any sort of Messiah. He's lacking anything of piety at all. The way, according to tradition, the way he tested the courage of his men is everyone who wanted to join his forces had to cut a finger off, which is against the Jewish law. I mean, you're not supposed to maim yourself. You can't do any of that. And so when the rabbis challenged him on that, then he ends up, they say, well, he's like, well, how am I supposed to test their courage? And they're like, well, they have to go pull a tree up that's still rooted and do it on their own or something like that. And so, but you can tell from that he was vicious, and there are many ways that he was in no way a godly man. And the godly respect went to this man, Eleazar. So what happens is the Samaritan is brought in to Bar Kochba and said, what did you say to him? And he's like, well, I'm not going to tell you, what I said, because if I tell you, then you'll either kill me, and if I don't tell you, you'll send me back to my master and he'll kill me. And so he was like, I'm not going to tell you. So then they bring Eleazar in, and Eleazar's like, I don't know, I was devotional, I was not even listening to him, I had no idea what the guy said, which they take as hiding it. But he's just telling the truth. And in a rage, Bar Kochba has Eleazar killed. And as soon as he has them killed, he loses all the support of everybody. And according to the story, those rabbis and what was left of any sort of Sanhedrin ruling immediately take Bar Kochba and behead him. And that's the end of the Bar Kochba revolt. And that's why later on, because of that history, he was nicknamed instead Bar Kochba, the son of deception. Did you get to the passage in Numbers? So read Numbers 24:17 for us.
I see him, but not now. I perceive him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob, and a scepter will arise from Israel. He will smash the forehead of Moab and strike down all the Shettites. Edom will become a possession. Seir will become a possession of its enemies. But Israel will be triumphant. One who comes from Jacob will rule. He will destroy the city's survivors. So
this was seen as a prophecy that was being fulfilled by Bar Kochba at that time, in one of the ways that supported. Now, at the end of the revolt, the result They had succeeded in creating the state for 2 years, but they got utterly crushed. Now, there's so many forces. In this time I've studied Roman history, and I've not looked closely at the Bar Kochba revolt until studying it for this time going through. I was shocked at the amount of Roman legions they sent. There's so many other stories where they send 3 legions, 4, and if it's usually it's 5. Like this, they're sending 6 legions plus enough auxiliary legions from different areas to make up another 3 legions. This is like 9 legions coming against them, and so they were not messing around. As a result, the land was depopulated. So when I said they systematically went through and they just killed all of the Jews, and at this point Christians would have been lumped in with that if they were there. They would have been considered to be Jewish. They renamed the country Syria Palestina, or just Palestina, and they combined it with Syria. But Palestina then becomes the name for many, many centuries, and that's why it's Palestinians in Palestine. And that word Palestina comes as a purposeful insult against the Israelites because it uses the name of a longtime foe, the Philistines. And so that's where Palestine comes from. It comes from the word for Philistines. If you were to look at the final result, not just in Israel, but in many areas of the empire, it would qualify as genocide, what they did to the Jews at this time. And then from that point on, the Jews are forbidden from Jerusalem for 400 plus years. In the mind of the modern state of Israel, to give you guys an idea, this is, I forgot to put in my notes where this is on what it's called, but this is a menorah in modern Israel today that's kind of celebrating their history. But in the central 3 right here, this is Moses. He's got his arms raised up, and Aaron and Hur standing, Joshua and Hur staring. Was it Aaron and Hur? Aaron and Hur standing on either side, holding up his arms. This is David holding up the head of Goliath, and with a harp behind it and a crown. And then this is Bar Kochba. So it's that central to them in the modern state of Israel. And the picture of Bar Kochba, his head is like this because he was defeated and beheaded. You see the sword that he has, and then this is the star above his head for the being the son of a star. It's intriguing to me to see how the modern state of Judaism looks back to this Bar Kochba revolt as a good thing, because there's many ways that it was not a godly thing, not a law-abiding thing, but the secular state of Israel today looks back and they're not as worried as much like necessarily the law-abiding. It's like he was a freedom fighter. He was fighting for freedom with Rome, and so that idea of freedom fighting is what made him so important as the final one to have stood up and given his life for that. So that's the kind of in a sense the end of where we're as far as we're going in history. Except there's one last thing I want us to grasp, and that is the concept of Jewish rabbinic literature. The reason why this is important is because as you guys are studying, the deeper you go in your studies, you will hear commentators, or you'll read commentators, you'll read books, and people will be quoting stuff from rabbinic literature. They'll be quoting from the Mishnah, they'll talk about the Talmud, and they'll talk Torah sisters, things like that. And they're bringing out these Jewish interpretations of things. And there was a big push at the end of the 1900s to get back to the Jewishness of Jesus. But in order to get back to the Jewishness of Jesus, they went back and studied the Jewishness of the rabbinic literature time. The rabbinic literature period was like 200 to 300 AD. So this is well after Christ. The rabbinic literature came out because they were wrestling with, we clearly are not going to get a land again. We're clearly not going to be back in Jerusalem. We clearly are not going to have a temple again. How do we worship and what do we do? And so rabbinic literature developed during that time. Also, it was during this time that that they realized our oral law is getting lost. I mean, so much of the Jewish population was wiped out, and then they were no longer together in one nation, and then they're out spread in nations, and their kids are marrying, intermarrying and stuff like that. They're like, we're going to lose this, and so they finally write down the oral law. So a good amount of this is the written down oral law, and I want you guys to just have this and know these terms as best as you can. The Tanakh is just an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. So Tanakh just means the whole Old Testament. So if you hear the word Tanakh, that's what it is. Torah is the first 5 books. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so if you read Torah or Tanakh, that actually is scripture. Mishnah is the Pharisaic oral law put into writing. So all these oral laws that the Jews had when Jesus was teaching, they finally put it down into writing. It had been forbidden to be put into writing until this time. They weren't allowed to put it into writing. And when they do finally put it into writing, it's the 3rd century AD. Now, remember with centuries, 3rd century means the 200s. 1st century was 0 to 100. 2nd century is 100 to 200, and so on and so forth. The Talmud is the Mishnah with the commentary on it. So it's the oral law and commentary on the oral law and how to observe it and such like that. That was done by the rabbis. And the Talmud can be used to refer to just the commentary or the two together. There's a commentary that was put together in the area of Babylon. Remember that we had the large Jewish population in Babylon. Because they're in the Parthian area, when Rome went on its killing spree, they were not included in that killing spree because they were not under Rome. And so that became one of the larger Jewish populations. Also, as just a heads up, at the end of the Bar Kochba Revolt, that's when a lot of the Jews are sent up into northern Germany, and the Jewish population in northern Europe gets started. That was at the end of the Bar Kochba Revolt. There's a name for that Judaism, and I'm not going to remember it. And so the Mishnah, the Talmud, is usually referring to just the Babylonian Talmud, which is the rabbis from the Babylonian area and their commentary on the oral law. There is a slightly older version that is with the Jerusalem Talmud that sometimes would be included with that. Now, why is this significant for Christians? One, rabbinic literature is Pharisaic in nature, and it's not profitable as a guide to us. Judaism of Jesus' day was made up of Pharisaism, Sadduceeism, Herodianism, Hellenism, the common person, and then Jesus was none of those things. He was true Judaism coming in that was unaffected by that, and he consistently took apart their oral law, consistently took apart their ways of practicing Judaism. He did not value that at all. He followed the actual law, never their oral law. To then say, we want to recapture the Jewishness of Jesus by going back and reading the oral law and the commentary on it, you're not getting Jesus. You're not going to get Jesus, and you're not going to get his disciples, and you're not going to get early Christianity. And so that movement that started, and it's very popular amongst the evangelicals and still carries a lot of weight, that movement, it was an unwise movement, and I feel went directly against what Jesus said by beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Because they're going and reading all this oral law and going, well, how does that help us understand what's being said in the New Testament? And I hope you guys can tell that's not, according to what we know now, that's not good. Now, most Christians, when they think about the Mishnah and so on and so forth, they think they're reading something from in between the Old Testament and the New Testament because they don't know the history and they don't know when it was. And so they think that it was shaping all of that. Now, the oral law definitely had developed by that time. But a lot of that was something that Jesus didn't agree with, and so out of this, very specifically, the narrative for the Passover Seders were written down in 200 AD, not prior to the time of Christ. There actually is a huge influence on the Seder with Greek dinners that they had, as well as some of the Christian aspects to how the Christians started to change the Passover that then becomes reflected in the Jewish Seder, not vice versa. It was not the Seder that came to reflect what Jesus was doing on the night of his death. It's more of what Jesus did on the night of his death ended up having an effect on the Seder. And so, but we reverse that a lot of times. When you have something, let's do a Jewish Seder, they're kind of telling you, hey, all of this stuff in the Jewish Seder is probably what Jesus did with his disciples. And it's like, no, he didn't. All of that narrative that's in the Jewish Seder was written down 200 years after Jesus died. And here's the key thing, it's written down because they need a way to celebrate Passover without a temple. But when they had the temple, you didn't have the Passover Seder. You went to the temple and you offered the sacrifice, and you took that sacrifice someplace and you ate it. And they probably had some things that they went over. Jesus redefines that. I feel personally that with the words of Jesus saying, as often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me. He's saying, as often as you do the Passover, always do it in this way to remember me. And he's redefining how to do the Passover. I don't think it's wrong for us to remember that every month. But he actually was, for them at that point, saying, that Passover pointed to me, and now I want you to remember me with the Passover rather than what you were doing before. And so when we understand this and get the whole history and the flow, we begin to realize that we need to go to the New Testament and let the New Testament give us the understanding of the Jewishness of Jesus. Because while he came and he was with his own and he was Jewish, he was God, which made him something far above Judaism. And he was what is truly good without corruption. And so going and reading all of the rabbinic stuff, trying to then find the mind of Christ or the mind of Paul, you're going to be led astray more than helped by far. All right? That's it for this semester. We have about a half hour. I wanted to be able to take questions on all of the stuff and see how you guys have done. And if you feel like you got a grasp of it, and you can ask questions from any portion of the class. The Jeopardy music right playing right now. Yeah.
I have a silly question.
There's no such thing as silly questions, just silly people who ask questions. But go ahead.
I mean, there were generations of people and millions of people and millions of animals and their chariots and their swords and all their stuff. But there's little proof of them. Their bones are all just dust.
Mm-hmm.
So our generations will be just dust too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
You say that just to cheer us up tonight? Yeah.
They're digging up the city of David, and they found stuff. They found like a Roman sword under there, and they found all different kinds of artifacts, earrings.
Yep.
Seals.
Yep. One of the interesting things they found is they found one of the bells for on the high priest's robe that they used to wear because it's shaped like a pomegranate and beautiful workmanship. All of the history of the world, it is people like living and dying. And the thing that we always need to stop and remember is just how little of actual life is recorded. Think through your entire lifetime, how much of what you have experienced is actually recorded somewhere so that somebody 1,000 years from now can find it.
The Lord's recording it all. That's
right. But the reason why I say that is that we have people, we're sitting going back 2,000 years back, and all we can base it off of is what's been recorded. And then we're calling all this stuff into question because it's not maybe in what was recorded, or it's we don't know. There has to be a humility of realizing we're working with very little information. Like when I talked in the sermon on Sunday where people were questioning about, Luke recording that it was Quirinius that was, doing it. Oh, well, we can prove this. Like we have very little sources on this and some that contradict. And if one person said it wrong, then somebody copies that and so on and so forth. And I tend to trust Luke more than I trust, these other guys, because Luke was closer to it historically than Tacitus and all these other guys. And so that's, that's that caution of realizing there's so much that's happening that's not ever recorded, that just they do become bones and dust, and it's there because it's God and what He's doing, and He is remembering it all. But we are just humans, and we can't go back perfectly and recapture all of that. So.
What I noticed is God uses bad things to accomplish His good. It's like covering up the temple areas.
Mm-hmm.
King Nebuchadnezzar. And this last one that you said that they ended up killing him, but because he actually claimed to be God.
Yeah, and you have God's wrath going out on those people. I brought this up. This is the Bible program that I use. You get to the book of Revelation. Let me give us more text here. So let me go up to the beginning of the chapter. I can't see over there to see whether I'm getting an arrow or not. Okay. So Revelation 17. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." Now what I want to kind of show you guys, and I want you to know, I'm not saying this is how to understand Revelation, because I'm like 50-50 on some of the different views on Revelation, whether it's historicist or preterist. But preterist is the title of the view that says this stuff was fulfilled back in the first century, or a good amount of it was. And when you growing up in the backgrounds that we have, sometimes it just seems so impossible. Like how could that ever be the case? And what I want to show you is how it can be the case, not because I think this is the right view, but because it will help us be humble enough to not stand on one view authoritative, because I want you to understand how complex it is. When I go and I study it, I'm like, oh, wow, this so fits, some of these things. So then one of the seven angels who had seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on the earth have become drunk." And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. So there's the woman, and there's a difference between a woman and a prostitute. There's a question, are they the same person or different? But you have this woman who is sitting on this beast, scarlet beast, who is full of blasphemous names. Now, one of the interesting things about the scarlet beast is the Romans, when they came in, their colors were scarlet and gold. If you see their SPQR things, it's all scarlet. The beast has 7 heads, and so it says. I'll keep reading. So the woman was arrayed in purple, scarlet, adorned with gold jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of the abomination and impurities of a sexual immorality. I lean towards this being Israel myself at this point as I'm reading it. And on her forehead was written the name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes, of the earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So that would be the Jewish persecution of the Christians. And when I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, "Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was," and I'm going to try and remember if it's the woman that's Israel or, anyways, it's complicated. "The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will marvel to see the beast, because it was, and is not, and is to come." This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains upon which the woman is seated. Now, if you guys remember back at the beginning, we talked about Rome. It's a city on 7 hills with a coin with a woman sitting on those 7 hills. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain a little while. The 5 of whom have fallen would be Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, Claudius. See if I can get them all in here. Claudius, and then So it's
That's-
Caesar Augustus, Tiberius, and then I forgot Caligula, Claudius, and then Nero, or not Nero. So I start with Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar, and then that you get to Nero. Nero is the one that is, if you're taking this as being written during the time of Nero, one who is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only a little while. So you'll remember that as soon as Nero is killed, he's taken over by Galba, but Galba was only there for a short time, and then he's taken out. As for the beast, that was and is not, and is it is an eighth, but it belongs to the seven. Now, the basically that seventh one was like Galba, but it was that year of 4 emperors, and it ended with Vespasian actually being the emperor. And so when you have the fact that as for the beast, that was and is not, it is an eighth, but it belongs to the seven. So you think about how you had Vespasian and Titus. Titus was an eighth, but it belonged to the seven because he reigned with his father, and it goes down to destruction, which we then see. I don't know what just happened. It goes down to destruction, which you see Titus. When he comes to power, ends up dying in 2 years, and you have this all this other stuff, this Vesuvius and everything going off. And the 10 horns that you saw are the 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast, and they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord, Kings of kings. And so they see this as the persecution then that comes at that time. And what you see is, if you're saying, yeah, but what about this? It's like, that's why this is so complicated to figure out. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and language, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute, and they will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. So this is the prostitute is Israel. I think the woman sitting on the hill is Rome. The prostitute is the Jews, and so they're going to hate the beast, and they're going to burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to carry out His purpose, being of one mind and handing over the royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has dominion over the kings of the earth. So the woman is the great city, Rome, sitting on the 7 hills. The prostitute is Israel, and these nations all turn against Israel, and you see that even in the Bar Kochba revolt. So you can see. I just want you guys to see that if you know all the history, it's like, wow, that I could see that fitting. And then you get to the fact that the number of the beast is the number of a man. And the number is 666. And as we talked about it, I think I mentioned this already. If you take 666 in Hebrew, it spells Nero Caesar. And so, and there's actually a Greek variant manuscript that has 616 or 616, and that is a variant spelling of Nero Caesar in Hebrew. You can spell it 2 different ways, and so there's a lot of stuff that makes it so that if this is written in 65 at the time of Nero, that you could see it predicting the things that happened in the first century that we're often completely unfamiliar with as Christians. Now, you're going to find problems with it, though. Like when I've gone through and said, oh, well, then I'm just a preterist. Well, then I still find issues, and I'm like, well, what about this? And what about this? And that's why it gets so difficult. I bring this up just to show you that this is why I love the denomination that we're in. The EV Free denomination does not take a strong stand on end times, and they allow for people. This is what I call coffee theology. This is great to sit down and talk about over coffee. I think it might be this. Well, it could be this. Well, maybe this. But you don't get up and go, this is the way it is. Here's my timeline chart, and this is how the end's going to happen. There's reasons why this is so complex and why it has been complex for centuries. And I believe that Revelation, when it was written to keep us from necessarily seeing all of this until the end and knowing it. But it is very possible that some of this is John predicting what is going to happen, because especially if he's writing this during the time of of Nero, then those churches need to know, don't get involved with what's happening in Jerusalem. I mean, that's the message of that, because I am confident myself that Matthew 24 is talking about 70 AD, and the message of Jesus is, when you see this stuff, get out of Dodge. Flee to the hills, go, pray that it's not in the winter, pray it's not when you're praying, but it's like, you get out of Dodge, you don't want to be a part of what's about to happen here. And that's kind of the purpose, of some of this, is to say, don't get involved with this, don't get involved, because as a Christian, what would you do back then? Because Judaism and Christianity were still so close. Do we get involved in the Bar Kochba revolt? Do we jump in and try to do this? Should I understand this as being done? And sometimes because we live so far ahead of that, we don't realize how valuable that would have been for those churches in Ephesus and that area to have been instructed on. So, anyways, so that's kind of my last thing. Any other questions that you guys have? I'm sure that what I just said didn't raise any questions at all. But
Wait, Dwayne, isn't there a blessing in reading the book of Revelations that talks about? So we should be trying to understand it, right?
yeah, the thing is that what Revelations does is it gets across a meaning without specificity. In other words, we win. How do we win? Well, God comes in and he wins. Well, when do we win? When is this going to happen? How is it? It's like it doesn't have all those specifics, but the message is still there. The world's going to hate you. The world's going to come after you. You're going to be victorious. You're going to win in the end. And no matter what happens, all of this is actually God's sovereign working. He's the one doing it. So there's a meaning to it that encourages us and blesses us. But when you get to the final end and we look back when it's sure, the biggest thing that it is it shows God's sovereignty, because it was written down at the beginning. It was written down before any of this happened. And then if we're able to look back and see that it happened exactly the way he said it, that shows his sovereignty. He can make it happen the way he wants. So I think that's part of the blessing as well.
When the Babylonians, when they were defeated and they're not a country anymore or power, they spoke Aramaic. So there's nobody that speaks Aramaic here anymore?
There are people there are still those that speak forms of Aramaic. Okay. But no, languages don't survive that long without being affected by too many other things. So even the form of Aramaic spoken at that time is definitely not the form you would speak today. But there is still Aramaic being used. But it's I'm pretty sure that Syria still speaks Aramaic. But I mean, if you just think of the difference between the original King James, like when it came out with all the F's, S's, and the way that it's spelled, and the expressions that you use versus the expressions today. No language remains so static that you can say the language spoke back in Babylonian times is still spoken today. It gets corrupted too much. Any other questions?
Something real unusual yesterday. Giving an estimate to a lady, let me know she was Roman Catholic and had these artifacts. One was like a brass cross with like a ruby in there. Inside a ruby, you shaking your head. Yep. She said, "This has been authenticated. This is the wood off the cross." And she got it out of Baghdad. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness.
How much it cost her?
Well, she also had other crosses.
I got some land at the southern end of Florida to sell you.
Of saints, one was for the children, one was to pray for cancer, and anyway, it was just too far over the top.
In the medieval times, the hunger for relics became very important. Where it actually, it's the tradition now that in every Catholic altar you're supposed to have the bone of a saint, an actual bone of the saint, and it's like there was no way to authenticate bones. There was no way to authenticate any of that stuff. And the sale of relics became a huge profitable business, and churches would have that, but they would go on pilgrimages to go to these places and see that. And that's when the cross, look at if you took all the pieces of the cross that have been sold, you could probably build the ark with it. So,
Eugene, I mean, not Eugene. Dwayne, they used to say at when you go up to Love's bookstore, if you wanted to sell your house, you'd get a little statue of Joseph and bury it in the ground in the back and help you sell your property that much quicker. So, I don't know if that was true or not because I never tried it, but I've had people tell me it works.
interesting. Yeah. Well, it's like when I was at the Chinese church, and if you, they make choices on houses by the address numbers. If it has lucky numbers in it, it has 7 in it, or things like that. We bought the church property we were in because the address was 777. The church and the church leadership made that decision because it was a lucky number that they bought the church building, and yeah, and then they won't buy houses at the end of a street because all the bad chi flows into your house, and they won't buy a house that backs onto a riverbed because all your good chi will flow out and go down the riverbed. I mean, yeah, that's where I put that burying of Joseph to bury.
Yeah, I don't want to get scared at night, be having nightmares and stuff about all this stuff,
All right.
Thank
So
you.
the next section of the class is going over all the culture, marriage, and what was the military like? What was it like to live at that time? What did you do for entertainment? What kind of clothes did you wear? Because a lot of these things are mentioned in the New Testament as illustrations, or they're talking about things, and once you can understand a lot of these things, there's 2 key things you'll have. You'll be able to grasp what the New Testament is saying, but you're also going to be shocked how close their lives were to ours in what they did for entertainment, how they lived, what they did politically, sports. You're going to be shocked how much they were like modern day America. So yeah, we'll get into that starting in January. The first class in January will be January 11th. So my last day under 50 years of age. So
You better try to hold on.
So this is the last
It gets
class.
worse.
this is the last class until January 11th. So we're all done until then. All right.
You gotta hold on to it, I'll tell you.